It's the last day of April, Striper Cup kicks off tomorrow, May 1st, and the fishing is only improving up and down the Striper coast. In this Striper season update, brought to you by West Marine, Jimmy Fee and Kevin Blinkoff discuss where the big bass are in their migration, along with Minnow Plugs, one of the most tried and true techniques for early season stripers of any size. As the season continues to ramp up, don't forget to sign up for Striper Cup at any time, and best of luck on the water.
So as we get further into the striper season, everybody is thinking about what's going to be their hot plug for this coming season. And in the early weeks, at least the reports coming from Jersey and Long Island, it seemed like Minnow Plugs have been the hot ticket this year. I mean, to the point that some tackle shops have been selling out. That's been helped out by some really high-profile catches. There was that enormous fish caught by a surfcaster named Erica out of Long Island. That was caught on a Yo-Zuri mag darter, and I know it has mag darter in the name, but that still falls under the minnow plug category. And to talk more about this style of plugs, we've got Kevin Blinkoff this week. Kevin, how's it going?
It's going well. I got to mention, I think you just got your first striper of the season surf casting on a minnow plug yourself. Is that right?
I did, yeah. I was down in Jersey last week and managed to get my first surf striper of the year. I did catch a couple back in February through the ice. I don't know if that really counts.
Definitely does not count.
But it was cool nonetheless. But I did catch my first surf striper of the year. That was on a Daiwa SP Minnow, and it was just great to kind of reconnect. We were fishing on the shores of the Raritan Bay. I was with Andrew Burke, who we had on the show last week. And this week, I want to talk to you about minnow plugs and why they're so successful for striped bass fishermen.
Yeah, well, let's start off with what is a minnow plug, because you mentioned the mag darter as being a type of minnow plug. When I think minnow plug, I always think right away of like the original Rapala as like the start of the minnow plug. So what defines a minnow plug?
Well, you brought up Rapala. That's a good thing to go all the way back to. Is the first one was carved by a man by the name of Laurie Rapala. And, you know, I was never sure whether it was Rapala or Rapala, how you pronounced it growing up.
Yeah, for me, it was always Rapala growing up. And maybe that was a freshwater, like Great Lakes thing. We always called them Rapalas, even though the inventor's name was Rapala, and it seemed like that was the right way to say it. I don't know. Now I try to say Rapala, but yeah, occasionally now and then you slip back and call it Rapala again. I think either one's acceptable.
Well, anyhow, he carved the first minnow plug out of cork using a shoemaker's knife, and then he wrapped it in tinfoil or foil from a chocolate bar, and he used that to catch Atlantic salmon in Finland. And he used that because he wanted a lure that mimicked an injured bait fish. And there wasn't anything on the market that was quite working the way he wanted it to. And that lure really seemed to take the fishing world by storm.
Yeah, it's tough to think of another invention, like a lure that has come out that has been so successful, lasted so long, and created so many different types of kind of spin-offs. So many different versions of everything from the other classic minnow plugs you can think of, Rebels, Bombers, things like that. All the way to the modern minnow plugs, like you mentioned, the Daiwa SP Minnow, the Yo-Zuri mag darter. Even I would say some of the big metal lip plugs that we use today, kind of, you know, it's a variation, and it's usually a bigger body and a metal lip, but it's that same kind of idea of a minnow shaped body and then some sort of lip that makes it swim, gives it kind of a side to side action as it comes through the water.
Yeah, and that lure was so revolutionary when it first came out that, you know, tackle shops, when they could get inventory, they sold out very quickly. Shops were actually renting the lure. And you think of going to a shop, you know, renting a rod and reel, you can rent a boat. I'd never think of having to rent a fishing lure. It seems like something that you would, end up losing and have to pay many times the price for. But that's how in demand that lure was before more lure makers started jumping on that bandwagon and creating their own.
You know, going back to calling it a Rapala, that's what I grew up fishing, Great Lakes area, fishing in Ontario for everything from, you know, smallmouth bass, pike, so on and so forth. Those were just some of the most effective lures. Part of it was being a young angler, and it's sort of a straightforward lure to fish. Good for, you know, you can just cast and retrieve, and you can make that plug work and catch fish. So a lot of those lures started off as kind of freshwater, and then I think moved into more of a saltwater realm. And when you look back in the 70s and 80s, that's when minnow plugs kind of were really popular. I mean, long-standing world record striped bass was caught on a minnow plug, right?
Yeah, it was a Rebel wind cheater, the one caught by Al McReynolds off the jetty in Atlantic City in a nor'easter. He used a wind cheater plug, which is still around today. You can still get a wind cheater. Not many guys are still fishing them these days, but they are fishing plugs just like them and still catching mammoth striped bass with them.
So that's one of the classics. What are some of the other classic minnow plugs? Do you still fish them, or do you kind of use all the new school plugs now?
Oh no, man, I am never without an original redfin. I always have one of those in the plug bag. And it's kind of unique among the minnow plugs in that the lip itself is molded into the body of the plug. So a lot of them have a clear plastic lip and the long, slender body. This one, the lip is actually a part of the body. And it has a hollow chamber where a lot of surf fishermen will actually add weight to that to help it cast further and maybe dive deeper. But right out of the package, it's a great lure. It swims on a slow retrieve. It'll get a good wiggle going right on or just under the surface. But if you put a little bit of water or lead shot, or back in the day, they used to use mercury to load it, and I wouldn't recommend that.
No, definitely not. So they call that loading a redfin. And what's the kind of the basic idea? How do you do that?
So because it has a hollow chamber, you'll find a spot, a lot of times up by the head, and you will drill a small hole, or you can heat up a nail and punch it through the plastic, and then you'll use a syringe to add the most often amount of water that people add to it is 10 cc's. That seems to be the sweet spot. You want to make sure you take some nail polish or some epoxy and touch up where the hook hangers and the nose, the loop where the line tie is, because those are all spots that water could leak out over time. So if you hit those with epoxy or just even clear nail polish, some Sally Hansen's hardest nails is what I use.
Yeah, anyone who ties flies knows that stuff. But so basically the idea is you add some kind of weight to the plug because it's hollow body, and that gives you the ability to cast it farther. But then you want to make sure you don't affect the action, or you don't affect the action too much, or maybe you do want to affect the action.
Yeah, if you overload it, it'll kind of kill the action on the plug if you put way too much weight in. But we just put out our 25th anniversary issue of On the Water, and I was combing through some of our past issues from the late 90s and early 2000s, and I found a story by Steve Shareka, who was a renowned surfcaster, great writer, did a lot of great stuff for us. He passed before his time, but he did a story on fishing minnow plugs on the outer beach and mentioned how he would load his redfins to 15 cc's, which is, I was surprised because it's a little heavier than what seems to be the most popular amount now. But the reason he wanted to do that is he wanted his redfin to dive deep and swim along the bottom and even kick up the sand to imitate a sand eel that was going in and out, setting up puffs of sand as it was avoiding a striper. So he loaded it a little bit heavier, wanted that thing digging along the bottom. And he said, if you knew you had it right and you knew you were retrieving it right, if you looked at your lure and the bottom quarter inch of that lip had the paint sanded off it by contacting the bottom so frequently.
Yeah, that's something that's, because of the wake up of these old classic minnow plugs like the redfin, because it's really just a hollow bodied plastic, you have that option to kind of tweak it and play with it. A lot of guys I know will change out hardware, and that can affect it a little bit too. You go to kind of heavier split rings, heavier hooks, that can change the swimming action. I remember you showing me once fishing some of the shallow sandy beaches that we have around Cape Cod. You took a Mambo minnow, which is a kind of a classic minnow plug itself, and showed me you would actually break or sand off the lip, which seems crazy. It seems like it would totally destroy the action, but for some reason that worked really well.
Yeah, that's a trick I actually learned from Steve Shareka also. He would take the lip and break it off or sand it down on a Mambo minnow and effectively create a floating needlefish with it. But the remnants of the lip on there would create a really pronounced V wake as you retrieved it across the surface. And in shallow, calm water, that is an absolutely deadly presentation. I mean, I caught onto it the night he hooked an enormous fish on it. And to tell you how shallow that water was, that fish actually got beached on a sandbar that, we were fishing a little trough with a sandbar on the other side. The water was so shallow out there where this fish was feeding. When he retrieved it toward the sandbar, it beached itself. It was just in a few inches of water, could not move it. We couldn't wait to get it. Eventually the fish rolled over on the line, broke the line, made its way back into the surf. And after that, I went home and I broke the lips off a few of my Mambo minnows.
Oh man, that's cool. Yeah, anybody who's fished those beaches and kind of understands, you get the series of sandbars, troughs like that. Those big, surprisingly big fish in shallow water will cruise through there. And for the most part, yeah, they're looking up. They're looking something that's moving along the surface, creating a V-wake, which now getting back to where we started here with the redfin as being such a classic lure, that's really what that lure does so well when it's not loaded. So that's really the way I like to fish it best this time of year, especially in the springtime. I think you have a lot of fish that are looking for river herring. River herring tend to swim pretty close to the surface. A lot of times you'll see them just kind of leaving a V-wake right at the surface. And I think that really calls in fish this time of year. So if I'm fishing, again, it's springtime, you're fishing kind of more shallow, sheltered areas, herring runs, harbors, rivers, things like that. Not too worried about casting distance. I'm fine throwing that unloaded redfin. Doesn't need to go too far. And I know that if I'm crawling that back along the surface, it's creating that V-wake. And I'm feeling like if there's a striper in the area, they're going to come check it out. They're going to come hit that plug. They're going to smack it out of the water and into the air. You're going to know. So I use that as a search plug this time of year. It's just a really fun way to fish. And it can also call out some of the bigger fish too. So if there's a lot of schoolies around, you throw that redfin, you'll find the bigger, the herring eating fish, that 28 to 34 inch fish that's here early. So that's definitely a plug that's in my bag this time of year.
So besides the redfin, we already mentioned the Mambo minnow is one of the kind of classic old school minnow plugs. There's also the bomber long A. That's one. Rebel wind cheater's one. And then Kevin, tell us about some of the newer generation of minnow plugs. What else is out there besides the Daiwa SP minnow?
Yeah, I would say, what we really seen in the Daiwa SP minnow was one of the first to do it was lure designers realizing the minnow plug had great action. The downside of it was for surf casters, especially and saltwater fishermen, it didn't have the ability to cast far. A tail-weighted lure is always going to cast far. It's going to be like throwing a dart. It's got the weight at the tail, so it's going to fly straight and true. It's going to go farther. Most minnow plugs, classic minnow plugs, to work well, they're not tail-weighted like that, so they're not going to cast as far. So starting with the SP minnow, you started to see some different lure designers finding ways to change the weighting of the lure. And I think I'm going to ask you to describe it a little better because I think you know more, but how do they go about doing that? How do you weight a lure so that it still swims right, but it casts well?
So one of the ways that they do it in these plugs, the Yo-Zuri Mag Darter, was, I think, the first to do it. They were doing that in the early 2000s, late 90s. Mm-hmm. And for a while, the only ones really in the saltwater scene to do that until before Daiwa kind of picked up the ball there and started it's almost like a resurgence of minnow plugs over the past 6-7 years. But what it is that you have a small sliding weight. They call it their internal casting weight. And it on the retrieve, when that plug is diving, when it's nose down, that is stuck to the front of the plug with a magnet. And then when you go to cast it, the force of the cast is going to throw that weight to the tail of the plug, which is going to help it cast straight and then cast farther. And that's really the main difference between this new generation of minnow plugs and the older ones, the old bombers and redfins.
Yeah, and then along with that weighting system that helps with casting distance, the other thing that new modern minnow plugs tend to have is an improved finish. So when you think of like a redfin, the bone redfin is classic, all white. It works well. It's a great pattern. But there are times if you want something more realistic that looks actually more like a bait fish, you're seeing now in some of these modern minnow plugs incredibly realistic patterns. They've got a clear coating over them, internal reflective surfaces, things like that, about as realistic looking as you can get. And then on top of that, you also have better quality hardware. So they're designed for striper fishing. You don't have to worry too much on most of them about changing out the hardware. They've got the split rings, they've got the hooks on them that can stand up, and they're going to stand up to catching a big striped bass or a big bluefish in the surf.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to worry about the kind of the guts being pulled out of those plugs as could happen with some of the older redfins. Redfins, you fish them for a while too, and they'll crack. And that doesn't happen quite as often with these newer plugs. They're a little bit more heavy duty.
But speaking of the hooks, one thing we are seeing, if there is a drawback to minnow plugs, I would say, especially when it comes to fishing striped bass, you've often got 2 sets of treble hooks, sometimes even 3 sets of treble hooks. When you're doing a lot of catch and release fishing, you don't want to have all those trebles swinging around, causing damage to fish. So one thing that people are doing now to kind of modify these plugs is to switch them out for some single inline hooks, different options like that. So that you're doing less damage to a fish when you catch it. It's easier to catch and release. Have you experimented at all with that, with switching out to single hooks?
I have done that quite a bit. And one of the things you want to keep in mind when doing that is making sure that you're choosing a hook that's, one, not only big enough, an inline single hook that's big enough, but also closely matches the weight of the treble, or at least approximates the weight of the treble, because those plugs are balanced in such a way and getting their action in such a way from the hooks that are already on them. Mm-hmm. So if you put too light a hook on there, that's going to change the action. Too much is going to change the action. Also, simply removing the tail hook is also going to change the action. Sometimes that can be for the better. Without a hook at the end or even a hookless flag at the end, it's going to be a much wilder action as you retrieve it. But if you do put something on there to kind of slow that down, then it's going to be a more moderate action. So you have to keep that in mind when swapping out your hooks. One of the things I've been doing more of with Minnow Plugs, I do use the inline singles, but I'm going to a single belly treble, crimping the barbs on that, and then either a single hook at the end or a hookless flag at the end. And hookless flag is basically, it would look like a hook that has the bucktail hair tied onto it, but then the actual barb and point is cut off. It's just a straight piece of wire that's dressed up, and actually adds a little action to the lure and a little bit of extra size too. Gives you a bigger profile.
Yeah, and that's kind of cool. I mean, we were talking, starting with the redfin up into what you're describing right now. One of those great things about minnow plugs, and it's something surf casters love to do especially, but I think all fishermen, you tinker, you fool around, you try and give yourself an edge over the other fishermen around you. You take one of those minnow plugs and you play around with the hooks. You come up with something that works well for you, maybe tie up a bucktail flag for the back on the tail end there. And hopefully you'll get one of those days, one of those nights where your plug is just exactly what the fish want. You figured it out. And that's one of the big rewards of striper fishing right there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Always having an edge over the guys around you, or at least looking for it. Another way you can try to give yourself an edge over the other fishermen around you with minnow plugs is mess with your retrieve a little bit. I mean, minnow plugs are designed in such a way where you can take it out of the package, cast it out there, and reel just fast enough to get that plug moving, and you'll feel it in your rod tip when it's working right. You're going to feel the thumping of the minnow plug wiggling out there, and that's all you need to do. But sometimes the bass want something a little bit different, or any little change up in your retrieve can really help it stand out. We fished with Captain Rob Radliff last week for a little bit, and we talked about fishing all types of different plugs. And he said early in the season, when the water's still cold, he'll fish the Daiwa SP minnow and other minnow plugs almost like you would a jerkbait for largemouth bass. And that's not something I'd really heard too much of for stripers. When you're fishing a jerkbait for largemouths, which is basically just a minnow plug, you are snapping the rod and making it twitch and then pausing it, letting it, if it's a suspending plug, it's going to stay right there. If it's a floater like the SP minnow, it's going to come back up a little bit. And he said in the colder water, when those fish first show up, that retrieve is deadly. It's more deadly, works better than the
so long pauses because the fish are kind of slow and less active in the cold water.
Yeah, the fish are sluggish, are not feeding quite as heavily, so that erratic, sharp action gets their attention, and then the pause gives them a chance to swim up and overtake it.
Yeah, and that that's really kind of your options with the minnow plug, the speed you're going to retrieve it, and then if you add any rod action to it. And because minnow plugs, you've got a diving lip on the front usually that the faster it goes or the sharper you snap the rod, it's going to make it kind of dive and go deeper. And then the slower you retrieve, the less action you give it, the more likely it's going to stay near the surface if it's a floating plug, and you're going to fish kind of shallower. So you can adjust the depth at kind of where you're targeting the fish by how you retrieve, and then also if you're going to give it that kind of trigger that, a lot of times if you're doing a straight retrieve on a minnow plug, fish will follow it. And then you can kind of give it that snap, the pause, try something different, speed it up, slow it down, so that all of a sudden it looks like it's either trying to get away or flee, or like it's injured and stunned and it becomes easy pickings. Something that'll trigger that fish that's following behind it, keeping an eye on it, into striking.
So one of the plugs, when you're doing that retrieve and then popping the rod to have it kick out to the side, that really excels in that is the Yo-Zuri mag darter. And we talked a little bit earlier about how I classify that as a minnow plug. I know it's called a darter, but in the striper fishing world, a darter to me is kind of a larger, bulkier plug, and it has more of a flat top to it. And the action of a traditional darter is more of a slow, like side to side slide, just like that. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have the wiggle and the roll that your typical minnow plug does. So the Yo-Zuri mag darter's action has that wiggle and roll to it, even though it has the lip itself is more of a concave sloped lip, just like that, as opposed to an added on lip at the chin of the plug like most minnow plugs. But the mag darter still has that long, slender profile that you see on most minnow plugs, and that's designed to imitate smaller bait fish. You do have some bigger ones out there, some that are even made of wood that have an attached lip. Guys, they're typically called hand-carved lures. But for most minnow plugs, the plastic ones, those are meant to imitate sand eels, Atlantic silver sides, juvenile herring, even some full-size herring, but smaller bait fish. And that's really where they shine. That's why they shine early in the season, especially in the backwaters where those first arriving stripers are looking for some smaller baits.
So even though minnow plugs, they represent a smaller bait fish for the most part, a thin profile, they do catch some big striped bass. We mentioned that for a while, the world record striped bass was one that was caught on a minnow plug. I just saw a picture on Instagram recently of a woman who caught a really big striped bass. I believe that was on a minnow plug as well, Jimmy.
Yeah, that was on a Yo-Zuri mag darter. And I've been seeing some tackle shops and people post things that all the Yo-Zuri mag darters are sold out at local shops as a result of the some of the press that fish has gotten.
I remember Rhode Island. It was a late season fish a few years back. I'll probably have a picture of that somewhere, but somebody was fishing and kind of expecting schoolies and throwing a bomber and ended up catching a massive late season Rhode Island striper. That may have been as late as November even.
That was November. It was actually about 10 days after Hurricane Sandy. And that fish was caught on a black bomber. It was a 58-pound striper. And that, just goes to show going out looking for any fish, maybe a last fish to kind of wrap up your season. And big striper was there, took that bomber. And man, that's one of the biggest surf stripers that I've heard of in the past. That was 2012. Past decade. That may be the biggest I've heard of. I don't know if there's been many more fish over 58 pounds taken out off the beach. But yeah, tons of big fish fall to minnow plugs, fish of all sizes. And that's why they are a great lure to have. But in addition to those monster fish, any size striper is going to take a whack at a minnow plug. That's what makes them such a great lure to bring throughout the season. If you're not catching on some stuff that's, more geared toward larger fish, you can usually throw on an SP minnow or another minnow plug and at least get some action out there in the surf. Guys use them in the boats as well.
So definitely let us know if you enjoy fishing minnow plugs for stripers. Leave it in the comments. Tell us what are some of your best catches on minnow plugs. What are some of your favorites? What is always going to be in your plug bag whenever you head out? And we're going to keep doing this striper update every week, brought to you by West Marine. So make sure on YouTube, subscribe, follow us, like us, enjoy these videos, and we'll keep putting them out.